Hello, my name is Alex Isles and I'm going to be responding to a video today about what if Rome never conquered Britain. Welcome back. So in today's video, I'm going to actually do a response because a couple of days ago, a friend sent me a video just through into my phone and said, right, you've got to watch this. And the reason why was because at the end of the video, there's a couple of cute plushies of Romans and Germans. And it was by a guy called Cody from the AlternateHistoryHub, who you probably know far better than myself because he's got 2.1 million subscribers and I'm a tiny wee channel. But I watched that and I thought it was absolutely amazing. And so I thought I'd love to do a response to that and just discuss some of the things he talked about. So in today's video, I'm going to be doing a response to what if Rome never invaded Britain? Now, if you like the sound of that, why don't you subscribe now? Because I've got loads of content similar to this on the channel where I discuss intricacies in history and I absolutely love doing that. So I hope you'll join me on this journey. Now, let's get started. So to begin with, I wanted to begin by talking about some of the points that Cody mentioned, because I thought there were some really interesting things he brought out. The first thing I'd like to say is I really enjoyed his video. It was brilliant, and it was a great way of looking at it. But the thing is that I breathe this. This is my lifeblood, and as a tour guide, I'm going out, I'm reading the text, I'm reading all the things, and I'm boots on the ground. So I've read all about, pre-Roman Britain. I've read all about Roman Britain. I've read about the supposed Dark Ages or the early Middle Ages, and these areas I absolutely love. So because of this, an alternate timeline where we look at what happens if the Romans never invade Britain, this is something I find really fun. The first thing I'd like to say is obviously I'm taking up the same premise that Cody did on the Alternate History Hub, and it's the premise that the Romans just don't invade. Now he puts forward propositions that basically they could have tried to invade, the Claudian invasion failed, or there's a number of other reasons as well why the Romans failed to invade the British Isles. And I'm going to take the same point of view as well when I come to my response, which will be part 2 of this video. So the first point I'd like to say is very early on in his video, and this is the suggestion that when the Romans invaded, they wiped out the Brythonic kingdoms and wiped away the Brythonic heritage of this island. Now I find this really interesting because first of all, I would say that the Romans didn't wipe away the Brythonic heritage, and alongside this as well, he also says the Romans didn't put the Angles there on the island. Now there's two amazing things there to work with straight away that I find absolutely fascinating. The first one is wiping away the Brythonic heritage. I don't think the Romans did. So like in many places in the empire, when you're studying the Romans in depth, the Romans were fantastic at taking local regional culture and actually having a great deal of synchronicity, first of all, with their gods, but second of all, taking in that culture, but then putting Roman culture over the top. So what we see here in Roman Britain is that the Brythonic cultures in the regional areas did still survive in many different ways. So we see regional sort of dialects surviving. There's some wonderful studies, and if you watch my studies on where did the Anglo-Saxons come from, that's a video I did a while ago, you'll actually see that in one of the videos I point out that there is a suggestion that the Anglo-Saxons were speaking a Germanic language but with British dialects. And the reason why they were speaking a Germanic language with Brythonic dialects is because of the fact that basically when the Romans brought in the Angles and the Saxons, and later on they were invited as well, they mixed with the local people, and so the second and third generations that were born in the British Isles, they actually had these Brythonic accents even though they were speaking Germanic languages. The other thing as well is I'd say is that when he says that the Romans didn't put the Angles onto the British Isles, it's quite an interesting one because I actually did a video on this as well, the same video I've just mentioned, talking about how when the Romans defeated Germanic tribes are crossing over the River Rhine, they would actually take them and then settle them in other parts of the empire. And there's good evidence to suggest that defeated Rhinelander tribes were then taken across and brought into the British Isles, which is quite interesting as well. We also have evidence across the whole of Hadrian's Wall of Germanic troops being used from at least the 2nd century AD on the wall, and later on in the 4th century we've got definite evidence for Frisian troops heavily concentrated along Hadrian's Wall as well. So the Romans did bring some of the Anglic cultures or the Germanic cultures into the British Isles, and I actually think the Angles were a sub-tribe of the Frisians rather than Germanic because of the similarity between Frisian and Angle language. But I need to do a lot more reading on that before I can be certain about it. So the second point he makes is that there would still be Roman influence in the British Isles, and I fully agree with this, and I think it's a brilliant point he makes in his video, is the fact that the Roman trade across the south coast of the British Isles would have continued. There would have been trade across, and alongside this as well, as the Romans took over parts of the Netherlands, there would also be trade across from the Netherlands into the east coast of the British Isles as well, as those trade ships would have been able to go directly across and trade with the tribes on the east coast. So we'd see small-scale Roman trading posts where the local elite would have wanted to buy Roman wine, Roman goods, Roman culture, and there would have been influence there. And as he said, there would have been a possible Roman support or Roman troops sent over to support Roman allies on both the south and on the east coast, but definitely nothing to the same level as a full-scale invasion like we see with Caesar and Claudius later on. The third point was when he talks about the collapse of Rome, and he says it's the collapse of everything within the British Isles. Now, if you look at the late 4th, early 5th centuries, I don't actually think it was the collapse of everything, because we actually see that there was a mutation throughout the British Isles. It wasn't just a direct return to the old ways, and actually the theory that suggested that in the end of Roman Britain, they started taking over hill forts again and returned to Celticism is actually very much out of date now. There's a mutation occurs with the Brythonic tribes, so they don't continue being like they were in the pre-Roman period. What happens is instead we see a Romification of the tribal elite, a Romification of the British Isles. They become more Roman, and there's a different way of thinking as well, and we can see this all the way across. And even with the Germanic troops stationed here, they also have their own influence too. So for instance, up here in the north of Britain, so I live in Newcastle upon Tyne, which is built on parts of Hadrian's Wall, we see that at Housted's Roman Fort, Vindolanda and Birdoswald Roman Fort, there were actually evidence of basically these long halls that are built during the Roman period. So something that we can think of as Germanic or Anglo-Saxon was actually a part of the Roman infrastructure during the 4th century. So when we're seeing that, what we can sometimes think of as Anglo-Saxon could also be an example of how the Romans were already building, and then the Anglo-Saxons continued that as they came into the island, because there was that mixing of Germanic and Roman culture as well. So I think that if we look at it, when the Rome collapses, it's not actually a full collapse of everything in the British Isles. And in the same way, I would say that the Anglo-Saxons brought their own culture in, mixed it together, and they were always looking to the Romans as inspiration in many ways. If we look at the way of kingship, all of that sort of stuff, there's a lot of Roman influence within the Anglo-Saxons as well. So when we have this going on, I think we'd see a very different culture within the British Isles, where if there's no Roman invasion, it's not a case of suddenly there's a return to Celticism or anything like that, but culture is constantly mutating, constantly taking influences from other peoples and things like that, which would then result in a very different setup to how we imagine it today. So the British peoples would have continued on a different trajectory than if the Romans had invaded, and at the end of the Roman period we don't see a return to Celticism. We see something new coming out of that, where the tribal leaders actually act a lot more like late Roman elites with their rebellions against each other and the politicking between various tribes and peoples that eventually results in basically this sort of post-Roman Arthurian period, and it's actually in many ways the Britons that destroy themselves and allow for the Anglo-Saxons to come in. His fourth point that comes into this as well is actually the late Roman Romano-British hired mercenaries to fight for them, such as the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes that come in as well. Now this is really interesting because it's actually a Roman system. It's not actually a Brythonic need to hire mercenaries. They're copying the Roman system that's been going on since the 3rd century, where they would hire tribes, give them allocation of clothing, allocation of weapons, allocation of armor, allocation of land, and also rations, and they would fight on behalf of the Romans. So this late Roman system where the semi-mythical Vortigern hires Hengist and Horsa and comes over down into Kent, then what we're seeing there is actually the system which has been in existence since the 3rd century. The Romans are taking Germanic peoples and are basically using them as mercenaries throughout their empire, and the post-Roman kingdoms are influenced by the Roman system and are using that. So it's not mercenary hire, it's actually a creation of troops in the Roman method. The next point that Cody makes is a really interesting one as well, and this is the idea that the Brythonic kingdoms would have had a better chance of resisting against the Anglo-Saxons had the Romans not invaded. Now I actually strongly disagree with this, and it's one of the points that I thought was really interesting looking at this when I was writing these notes together, because the idea is that these kingdoms somehow would have had their own war bands and therefore would have been able to resist against the Anglic migrations. Now this is a really interesting point, because I think that actually the Romans caused for a militarization within the British Isles on a scale that would have really ramped up from what we see before. Because when we look at pre-Roman culture, there are, of course, an armed population, which are small war bands, but there's a big theory within people who study the British Iron Age that there were small groups of tribal champions who would fight against each other to basically resolve differences between the different tribes. So you don't necessarily see full-scale armies competing against each other, but what you do see is that tribes will take over each other, force their will upon each other, and then you sort of see new formations of these tribes, and then they would maybe break apart within a couple of generations, then reform and move, and it was very fluid. So I think that actually the Romans militarized Britain in many different ways. And one of these is that in northern Britain, we have the Picts. Now the Picts, I personally believe, are a direct response to the Romans, because what we see is in other parts of the empire, the Romans don't like dealing with tons and tons of little groups, and the Romans like putting a large powerful leader in control of an area so they have one person to deal with. They did this in many ways in the sort of the Rhineland and in the German areas, and over here in the British Isles in the 1st and 2nd and even into the 3rd century AD, you can follow Roman silver hoards throughout the whole of northern Britain, or Caledonia as they called it. Because what they would do is they'd give a large amount of silver to one tribal leader so he would have power, and then as soon as he looks like he's going to actually rebel against them, they just swap to another tribe. And they swap to another tribe, destabilizing the power bases and basically meaning that those tribes have then got a semi-alliance with Rome, and then over time it created the Picts and the Mannae up in northern Britain. When it created the Picts and the Mannae, eventually they felt secure enough to be able to attack, and that then resulted in some of the campaigns by Septimius Severus and Constantinus Chlorus during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. So that is an interesting one right there, that the idea that somehow you would have this sort of like a stronger ability to resist, when I actually think the Romans militarized these tribes, caused for more conflict and for banding together so they would be able to fight. My theory is slightly different. Instead, I think on the East Coast, what would have happened is that the Angles would have migrated across, and as they migrated across, they would set up small little trading posts, much like the Frisians did later on, and so you would have settlements along here, and more of a peaceful mixing between these various cultures. Again, I go back to one of the things I've mentioned in a number of videos, and this is Julius Caesar, when he's writing about the British Isles, says that the tribes in the southwest were similar to the Spanish, the tribes in the southeast were similar to the Gaulish and the Belgians, and the tribes in the north were similar to the Germans, which may hint at earlier migrations into the British Isles from other locations. But again, when we're looking at Caesar, we have to look at that's propaganda in many ways, because the Romans would try and to justify bringing civilization and conflict and conquest onto other areas, especially Caesar, who was actually using a warfare illegally against Roman allies and basically needed to justify his position. He then goes on talking about the Druids within his video, and I found this really interesting because he talks about Druidic culture. Now, we know very little about the Druids outside of our friend Julius Caesar again, and Caesar points out that the Gauls would come across to Britain, they would come across to Anglesey, and when they came across to Anglesey, they would train in the area for a number of years to become Druids. Now, when you're looking around here, I don't actually think there was a unified religious system for the British Isles. Especially up in the north, it seems that the religion could have been much more relaxed and much more sort of on a tribal basis, where you would have almost concepts rather than gods, and maybe holy sites, important places. Again, we have to sort of look at the earlier Bronze Age and earlier Celtic sites around Europe, where we see places of water and bogs are used for sacrificing into with both human sacrifice and also items as well. And so I think when the Romans come, many of the ways they would basically take these regional gods, and what they would do is that they would basically turn these regional gods into basically gods that they could worship and combine with. For instance, the Brigantes, when the Romans come up here, suddenly Brigantia appears, and Brigantia seems to be the female personification of the tribe as a goddess, who is then paired with Minerva. So I think that there's something different going on there, and the Druids were maybe, yes, they had a religious aspect, but a lot of the time they were more like judges and also intertribal intermissaries than they were sort of an overarching priesthood, as we see within Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and also the Hellenistic Roman religion as well. So there's an interesting one there. So I don't think the Druids would necessarily maybe have been a religion in their own unified sense, is what Cody suggests, but instead much more of a sort of fluid intermediaries between the tribes, and that sort of early religion would have still been very, very regional. So when Christianity does come in, as Cody suggests, I do think that that is one of the things that would have occurred, and there would have been a Christianization within this timeline. The big difference in this timeline is that it's a very different form of Christianization, because what we see is in Roman Britain, down the west coast of Britain, there is St. Patrick, and whether or not St. Patrick was from Wales or was from Cumbria or wherever he was from, what we do know is he goes into Ireland, and when he goes into Ireland, obviously he's a slave for a number of years, then comes back across, becomes a priest in Gaul, and then goes back to Ireland and sets up the Christianity there. And then the Irish missionaries come back across into the west coast of Britain and start setting up monasteries, and then are a big influence on the kingdom of Northumbria. And when Northumbria becomes Christian, that then has a big effect on the other kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons, which then results in Christianity being really bedded in. Obviously Kent was Christian because of its influence from Francia, but the others, well, there was obviously a remainder of the Brythonic Christianity, from which had been basically the Roman Christianity that had survived within the post-Roman kingdoms, but it wasn't to the same level. So in this alternative history timeline, what we're looking at is the missionaries are probably coming from Amorica, because again, Brittany doesn't exist because of the refugees from the British Isles going across into mainland Europe doesn't occur. And so because of that, we have Amorica and we have Northern Gaul. So we would have seen the priests from there coming across first into southern Britain and then traveling up, and then there would be a slow and steady Christianization. And when we come to my own interpretation of the history, I'll explain how I think that would have looked. So it's a really interesting one as well, where we see this Roman influence has such a big part of British history. We see again the Picts and the Mane up here don't necessarily form or don't exist, so we just have separate tribes up here which would have continued living in their pre-Roman fashion around their geographical areas. They may have formed together into larger geographic blocks formed by geography, and a really good example of this would be the book Prisoners of Geography, which then would basically suggest that where you're living geographically has a big effect on your culture. And I would have thought that maybe a lot of these tribes could have confederated together and become similar to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms later on, on of the sort of the heptarchy, the 7 kingdoms that we see, and then possibly alongside that as well up in northern Scotland, or sorry, up in northern Britain, or what is we today would call Scotland. They would have broken up into maybe the 4 areas of like the Highlands and Islands, the lowlands, and then the southeast and the southwest. That could have possibly been natural geographic groups, because when you're looking here you can see the Vortadinis, Legonai, the Damonti. I think those tribal groups could have been very much existed in this alt history timeline, and maybe grouped together around geographic frontiers rather than a sort of like a full unification into nations such as England, Scotland and Wales, which are caused by external pressure. Again, I would definitely agree that there is no Norman invasion as it looks, and I would actually put the invasion at an earlier point, and we'll discuss that in the next video when I talk about my alt history and how I see that going. One of the other really interesting things that Cody doesn't mention in this video, but I think would be a really interesting one to discuss, is language. And I've touched on it earlier when I talked about the Anglo-Saxons having Brythonic accents, but Germanic language. Now, when I was looking at Cody's video in the comments, I saw one comment and it made me really sort of chuckle, because he said, oh, well, if the Romans had never invaded and the Anglo-Saxons had never invaded, this commenter, they had said, well, they'd all be speaking Gaelic. And I thought that was really interesting, because actually Gaelic comes from the Scots invading. So the Scots invade across from Ireland, and so because of that, they then take over their language and put it onto the native peoples. But actually what we see is that possibly there were regional dialects and there was a difference between the two languages. Some language specialists even think that possibly a migration from the south of France and around Switzerland, roughly around about 1200 BC, introduced different variants of the Celtic or Brythonic languages. So you had P and Y Brythonic, and so the Y Brythonic was in the north and the P Brythonic was in the south. And so when this invasion occurs, it causes for a split between the two types of Brythonic, and you have a P and a Y variant, which splits down the country. So you have a northern and western variant and a southern variant caused by the migration of the two different Brythonic splits. So again, I think that's a really interesting one to look at, that the language may not have even been Gaelic or also alongside that Gallic, but instead could have been evolutions of the earlier Brythonic dialects caused by Celtic migrations, and there would have been a lot more sub-languages and possibly even tribes right up here in northern Britain in what's now Scotland, and tribes in southern Britain may not have been able to communicate with each other without someone as an intermediary to move between the two languages. So there's a really interesting one right there. Now, I really hope you've enjoyed this response to the Alternate History Hub's video and how I've been able to maybe bring this to life, discuss the differences and possibly the effect of what would have happened if Rome had not invaded. In my next episode, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to explore my own alternate history and discuss that in depth, and I hope you'll enjoy that one. But this is my sort of notes on Cody's video, and the link is in the description and also in the cards at the end of the video, where you can find his actual own video, and I really hope you go and watch that and then come back and have a discussion about it here. If you haven't already, please do like and subscribe, share the video around with your friends, and I'd love to see what they think as well. And if you'd like to support me further, I do also have a Patreon and a Ko-fi account, which you can find in the description. And if you would like to, you can support me there, but there's no pressure whatsoever from me. As always, have a lovely rest of your day, and thank you so much for watching.